Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Two Friends Film Podcast. My name is Brian, and I'm here with Fowler.
Great to be here.
First and foremost, we're going to get right into it. Fowler, take it away with the summary.
So the movie we're kind of analyzing is Bottoms, which is kind of a quirky coming of age black comedy about basically the story is in this high school in kind of a small Midwestern town, very paint by number stuff. There's a pretty brutal social pecking order. The toxically masculine football team is kind of at the top and worshipped by everybody. And the story follows these two self-described untalented loser queer teens, PJ and Josie, and their attempts to get laid and become cool. The story quickly divulges from kind of those stereotypes, though, because instead of more typical ways of doing this, their maneuver is they pretend to be dangerous, juvie offenders who have like murdered people in juvie, and they form, kind of using their street rep, a all-female fight club. That they're grossly unqualified to run. Things escalate from there and get out of hand. The members of the club actually do kick the shit out of each other. They all get together and do a minor case of terrorism by planning a bomb on one of the football players' cars and blowing it up. And then at the end of the story, during a football game, they enter kind of a murderous showdown with the rival, Huntington football team, where all of the Huntington football players are brutally murdered. And throughout all of this shit, the women in the club, they learn about each other, they learn about womanhood, they grow as people, and they form a community. It's a beautiful all-American story. If you remove the all the murder and the bombings and the
Yeah, I don't really remember that from my high school experience specifically, but, I guess I was
Well,
never.
it's the fight clubs are they're all female
That
run, so
also explains it. Um,
yeah.
so I guess we're gonna first touch on the strengths. For those listening fortunately, my man Fowler sent over a resume, so it's gonna be, or not resume, I'm sorry, a little cheat sheet so we can look at like the talking points more thoroughly. So hopefully for y'all listening, it's a little more streamlined that way. But first, we're gonna talk about the strengths. So you put down that it's extremely funny, which is correct. It's like got great. Everyone on the film has great chemistry. I think we didn't mention this yet, but Marshawn Lynch is like the main teacher, who is like in charge of the teacher advisor to the Fight Club, which is
Yeah,
pretty
he's a
funny.
great character. He his lesson plans are weird and don't make any sense. He describes feminism as it's like a man, some woman, and Susan B. Anthony started it. He reads pornographic materials at his desk during class. He, he talks about his divorce pretty publicly with the other children, and he just generally seems to have no fucking idea what's happening. He's great.
One of the other great parts too was like him asking the students to recreate the Treaty of Versailles, just as one of his lessons plans, which is just kind of remarkable to watch. Uh,
Yeah, I would say he's not the only one though. I think like it's not just that there's a lot of good chemistry between the different characters. I feel like a lot of the like supporting cast are very well acted, and they're very kind of interesting and weird in their own particular ways.
yeah, I think like overall, a lot of the jokes land, a lot of the jokes hit. I think we'll discuss this a little bit, but what I really loved about it was the male football players shown as like this overly toxically masculine sort of bravado mixed in with like a fragility that is just so funny to watch. Like there's one scene in particular where the main quarterback for the team, he gets hit by a car, like just slightly like grazed by the car on the
Like
hood.
2 miles an hour in a parking lot.
Yeah,
Like, yeah.
just like barely touched by this car, and then immediately falls, almost like he's been shot, you know? And then it culminates in all the football players gathering around him and just like cursing God for having done this to him, you know?
This is definitely an acquired taste film because,
Yeah,
like, I found it very funny, but it's incredibly foul-mouthed. There's like a lot of profanity, which I guess is typical of like high school coming of age films.
yeah,
But there are some pretty out there sex jokes that are pretty dark. There's sex jokes about like, there's a character whose like stepfather like molests her on her birthday every year, and they make jokes about that. There's jokes about like terrorism and stalking people and blowing people up and school shooter jokes, and then the violence is incredibly over the top, and that might make some people uncomfortable. And there's for me like a very hilarious ramp up where like the beginning of the film, kind of like what Brian was saying, like the first act of violence is like, yeah, this guy is lightly grazed by this parked car, and then like it's a huge sort of tension in the plot, and he comes to school like on crutches with his leg fucking wrapped up. And then by kind of the end of the story, like people are detonating bombs, people like there's a guy who is impaled with a sword. Like I really enjoyed how it really goes off the rails and just massively escalates as
I
the story.
I think what's great about the humor is just the absurdity of the narrative, like how outlandish it gets, like you were saying at certain points, where it goes from like this small little like plot point of that like little violent act to just literally terrorism, like just not even like like glossing it, like terroristic actions as well as like homicides throughout the entirety of the or throughout the very end of the film, you know?
It's a very surreal story, I would agree. And
Yeah.
there are enormous plot holes. A lot of things don't make sense. There are no consequences for most
Yeah.
people's actions throughout the story. There are no teachers. There are no police.
Well,
They're all a bunch of like well-off high schoolers, but they're like very quick to just murder each other. And it's not just the Fight Club ensemble. The rival team Huntington, like they're infamous for like murdering football players in the town, and they've like crucified people and like killed their dogs in front of them. So it's just you have to go into the story like and kind of embracing the absurdity and not looking too closely at some of the kind of gaps.
I mean, this is something we'll talk about the weaknesses a little bit too, but I find like at some points you can suspend your disbelief for so long till you're like, what the fuck is actually happening here? Like, there's a big scene where one of the girls in the Fight Club is like, oh, I know how to make bombs. Let's bomb shit. And you can see in the background like fucking like half a dozen teachers just listening to that very loud conversation without a concern in the world, you know? Uh,
Yeah, and I think sometimes it makes the film stronger by like building a lot of drama in like kind of very inane, ordinary struggles in kind of what it's like to grow up.
mm,
I think it sometimes hurts the film when it wants to be serious, and
yeah,
it's kind of hard to take it seriously because it's not particularly grounded. I will say another thing I liked about it is I thought the pacing was excellent. I don't think there's really any part of the film that drags and that I was just like trying to look at the clock. And then I would also say like the escalation of violence and the absurdity for me made the film incredibly unpredictable. The only part of the film that I knew was going to happen is obviously at some point PJ and Josie, they're going to be outed as not actually being these hyper dangerous felons who are like murdering people inside prison. And obviously the women were going to come together at the end of the story. But like beyond that, it was kind of a story where um, I never knew what the fuck was happening, and I never knew what was going to happen next.
yeah,
And you really, what happens next, every stage is just a massive escalation in how weird and absurd and violent everything became.
For me, it was always like this thing of like, we're going through it, watching it, but a lot of times what me and Fowler do when we watch films is we pause and like we talk about it. But a lot of times when we paused, we just like had to catch ourselves on just like looking at how ridiculous some of these situations are and just like kind of again rolling with those punches because like you can only uh you kind of have to realize the film you're watching at a certain point. This is definitely not anywhere close to the seriousness of the films we've watched up to this point at all. You know.
Yeah, and this film has it has a very distinctive swagger. I've never really watched something that um, feels like this film at all. I can't think of anything comparable.
I will say, because this is kind of more my genre speed, I've seen high school films before and some absurdist high school films. The things that came to mind when I was watching this is Booksmart as well as Superbad, right? Both
Mhm.
absurdist, like, high school comedies, right? Um, but I think what separates this film from those in particular is, like, the delving into the violent aspects of it. And I guess this is, I think, a good time to start kind of hitting on those themes a little bit more.
We're
Uh,
gonna talk about the weaknesses at the end of the review rather than at the beginning, like we normally do, because a lot of our critiques are about the themes that we're going to talk about.
yeah, because a lot of the themes, it seems like there's a lot going on here compared to like other films we've watched in terms of the themes. Um, the
Which
first one,
helps the film in some ways because it's a very ambitious project and hurts it in other ways when it can sometimes feel incoherent and a little too um, not focused enough to really be salient about anything in particular.
yeah, no, I 100% agree. So the first one we wrote down here was kind of the messiness of being a teenager. So like it's really that coming of age thing we were talking about. And I think the film the film does a good part of like that coming to grips with like where you fit in your role, especially in high school. But I will say like we talked about a little bit with the strengths and touched upon briefly with like a little bit of the future talk of weaknesses. But I think the absurdity of the plot makes it harder for those meaningful moments of being a teenager and like dealing with relationships and friendships and how they deteriorate or change. It kind of makes it, in my eyes, fall flat. I think. I don't know. How do you feel about
Mm.
it?
I I think that being a teenager is often a very messy process. And I think that like most good coming of age stories kind of capture that to some degree. So I think to some degree you have to expect a level of incoherence in especially the beginning of like a coming of age story. But I would agree that you know, the kind of larger than life plot and kind of these massive things that happen throughout the story, it does kind of move us away from character development.
Hmm.
There are parts of the character development that I did think were novel. You know, I think um, it has kind of the horniness and the profanity and all that stuff, but also like it kind of delves in an interesting way about like the dark side of kind of growing up and finding yourself is like selfishness and cruelty and manipulating, you know, other people, and how like those things are often part of the experience of becoming a teenager and growing up, not only from yourself but from other people around you.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because eventually we will delve into Superbad, but Superbad also tends to deal with that like messiness of being a teenager, right? And also
Mm.
themes about like, coming to terms with your, sexual sort of needs and like sort of what happens there, right? Um, so I think it's one of those ones where I think it it does when it does hit that nail on the head, it works. But I think a lot of the absurdity of the plot tends to navigated away from that theme, uh,
Mm.
in my eyes. So I think another thing you put in here was the underlying rage within society. So could you talk more about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously there's a level with like a film this absurd, like how seriously you take it. But I do think there is kind of a consistent underlying element of like, especially with the women in the school, like how much dark shit is happening, like to some degree them embracing the Fight Club and how quickly it falls apart and goes crazy. Like some of that is kind of just um the surrealness, but also the film talks a lot about how like there was already a lot of powder kegs. Like lighting the spark did not take a lot. There's parts of the film where they talk about like how many of those women experienced sexual assault, from family members, from other like men in the school. They talk about like the bullying that a lot of like the football team does to specific women. They talk about stalking. They talk about like kind of the inaction of authorities, like how you can't really go to the police to report like certain creepy behaviors of kind of predatory men. And a lot of people are just extremely on edge. And um like the one that comes to mind for me is like one of the members of the Fight Club is this girl Sylvie, who's like the one who was molested by her stepfather. And she's sort of like, in many ways, the most fanatical member of the Fight Club and the one that pushes, especially at the beginning of the story, for them to kind of escalate how violent they're being and to sort of like spread that violence out. And I think that's kind of interesting. And I think you see that a lot with marginalized communities, like through American history, like with how popular the Black Panthers were, where, for a lot of people, who do feel trapped by society and who do feel like they're at the bottom of the rung and do feel disenfranchised, just like how unstable that relationship is and how easy it is to get those kinds of people to grab their torches and pitchforks and sort of respond in whatever way they do.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because you talked about that power of community thing there a bit, and I think it's a really interesting film to showcase like how important it is to have those communities in your space, but also how dangerous having a community like that could be. You know, one of the things while you paused the film and we were talking about it was actually how this is very similar to how the formation of like gangs can happen, right? And do you want to talk about that a little bit as it relates to community?
Yeah, I mean, for those who know, like the rise of like the Italian mafia, the Jewish Irish mob, a lot of like the urban Black and Hispanic gangs later in kind of the century, like most of those gangs, the way they formed initially was like the communities that they were born in were marginalized sort of minorities who couldn't go to the authorities and were being persecuted. And so a lot of those gangs started out as essentially like protection for the community.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously, when you get a bunch of very angry people together and they bond over violence, that can have incredibly disastrous consequences. And it becomes kind of a monster in of itself. One of the parts of the film, and you could argue that this is sort of being too literal,
Mm-hmm.
but because you can perceive the violence in the film and the escalation of the violence of the film as being very allegorical, but there is kind of this constant um, point of the film of like violence helping these women sort of do things like the fighting each other, murdering all the Huntington football players, doing the terrorism. Like this is a massively powerful unifying force, and it causes the group to be strong, and it causes them to be able to work together. And it's violence is also a means of empowerment. Lying about killing people in juvie, hitting the football player with the car at the beginning of the story. Like doing violence makes you rise through the social ladder, makes other people respect you. It's like kind of this massively empowering force. And, there really isn't a part in the film like I think a lot of other films like Fight Club, where they really deconstruct the violence, and there's never really, I think, a point where there's any moment where the Fight Club really has to like come to terms with a lot of the insane shit that they're doing, and how like they have succeeded in radicalizing each other in ways that are not always positive.
Yeah, but I think even in this film, like, it doesn't take a huge leap to radicalize, the individuals in this film. I mean, it seems like, you mentioned this a little bit, but it seems like they were very quickly prone to violence. Like, it wasn't like a thing of like, in Fight Club where Tyler Durden is like kind of easing them into, you know, embracing those toxically masculine sort of traits in themselves. It was an immediate like, you know, swift punch to the face to PJ, right? Like, you know, it was like instantaneous, that click.
Mhm.
And it's I'm curious to to hear you on what you think. Like, do you think that is a good choice, or do you think like it would have been a better choice to kind of critique that violence and sort of think on it?
Well, I definitely think you have to critique the violence to some extent if you use it that powerfully and that like positively, I suppose. But I understand that this film is like, it's this is definitely a film that has things to say, but the priority of this film is definitely not having something to say over being funny and entertaining.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of parts in the story where it's very clear that like kind of the writers and the directors, like they could go more serious, they could take more risks, and for most of the film they really choose not to. um, but I also think like the ease is also tying to this idea of like community, which is,
Hmm.
I think, particularly powerful for teenagers, where you know having this club, having all the women come together, like it helps them all massively. It helps them develop their sense of confidence, their senses of identity. It lets them transcend a lot of like the social roles that they've been conditioned to do. um Embracing their sexuality,
Hmm.
um finding friendships, kind of braving the world, and also the power of like not being alone and being able to share very similar lived experiences, and really having these powerful connections with other people because of that. And I think that's a very deliberate choice, because the kind of women in the film, they're kind of isolated from each other, and they don't have that solidarity. Like it takes time for them to develop that rapport, versus like the football team, who are dumb as all hell, but they are like supportive of each other, and they
Yeah.
do come together. And that's not really the case, I think, for a lot of women. And I think the film does a great job of kind of talking about that, the difficulty of community for a lot of women, and but also how rewarding that can ultimately be.
And I think that's something actually I don't know if you mentioned during our strengths section was really that subversion with the males in the beginning of the film, where that community is way more supportive, right? And it's like kind of a subversion of that sort of, because yes, they are toxically masculine, right? But it's it's almost like they're embracing that sort of support role with one another in a very overly dramatic sort of portrayal.
Well, I think part of this comes back to like how difficult it is to find empowerment if you're not kind of socialized or in a role that lends to that, where like that kind of camaraderie and teamwork is like kind of beaten into a lot of men. But like for a lot of the women in the film, it's initially there's all these distractions, trying to be cool, trying to have sex,
Mm,
revenge, the cliques, like the football team versus the other people,
yeah.
like stopping them from focusing on themselves and the things that really matter in their life to make it better. But
Mm,
even when they all come together, I mean, a huge source of comedy and tension in this film is that like none of the women can really agree on like what to use the Fight Club for. Like, should they teach themselves self-defense? Should it be kind of a form of therapy and solidarity? Should they do a shit ton of terrorism, you know, and I think it's often very difficult, even when people come together in a sense of community, to move that community in a way that's actually useful and productive for everyone involved.
Yeah, and I guess this is are you good with the themes, or do you think this is a good time to move into sort of talking about the weaknesses of the film now?
We can move to weaknesses.
Okay. So on the list, the first thing you put was the cringe humor. What like I guess what is a moment that kind of stuck out to you as like being because I know you're not a fan of like things like Parks and Rec and The Office for its overuse of it. So I'm curious to hear what specific moment in the film you thought would be that kind of moment.
Yeah, I mean, cringe humor is just all over kind of like teen films and books in general. For me, it's just a personal taste thing. But like I thought for me, it's the violence and kind of the sex jokes and the um kind of the over the top sort of reactions. That was the thing I really enjoyed about the film. And especially at the beginning of the film, where like a lot of the humor is just like the two main characters just being weird and awkward and uncomfortable and
Yeah.
just like bombing at everything that they do socially. For me, like I don't find that particularly entertaining. It feels like I'm suffering through like the worst conversation I could possibly have, you know.
Yeah. Well, I honestly, I've always enjoyed that. Maybe it's because I grew up as an awkward teen myself, but I've always enjoyed like that sort of banter because it strikes at the heart of like, okay, this feels like sort of your teenage like adolescence, not really knowing what you're doing, and like kind of trying to figure it out on the fly, and really
Hmm.
fucking up a lot, you know. But that's also like a personal preference of mine. I do enjoy that from your movies like that. Now, if you're talking about like something like The Office or uh, some parts of Parks and Rec, yeah, I tend to agree with you because in this instance, it's adults doing that, right? Like,
Hmm.
if you're 30 or 40 years old, you should realize how to interact with a human being at that point, unless you've been living under a cave for your entire life, you know? So,
Yeah, definitely true.
yeah. So that's why I don't have as much of an issue with it myself. But
Hmm.
you also put down here a lack of earnestness. Are you talking about like in reference to this? Do you mean like essentially you felt like the sort of violence and the sort of tones of the film didn't like feel like they warranted those more dramatic moments?
Well, for me, it's just I think a lot of better comedies, you really empathize with the characters,
Hmm.
even if they're terrible people. You empathize with them, and you feel a kind of humanity underlying the humor that makes the story more powerful. And there were points in the film that happened. Like there's a scene where the Fight Club gets together and they have a therapy session, which is when they're talking about like being a woman and how hard that is and all the things that come along with it. It's also, I think, some of the funniest parts of the film because that's where like the rape jokes come in, and that's really the part where they get very enthusiastic about doing terrorism.
Yeah.
And the other one I think is Sylvie, who's kind of like the hot cheerleader stereotype who kind of comes into the story and ends up kind of exploring her sexuality and kind of trying to move out of those roles. I thought she was a very interesting part of the story where there were a couple points where she really felt like the heart, and there was a lot of very authentic emotional kind of confessions
Hmm.
about like what the club meant to her and her kind of struggles. And but like that's the minority. Most of the characters in the film, they're very funny, but they're very superficial, and you never really feel them, and you never really feel for them. And I
Well,
think that I think that makes the story um, harder. And I also think emotional honesty and earnesty is even more important for this film than most other films because of how surreal it is and because of how over the top it is. Like it feels without those emotional elements just incredibly ungrounded from kind of reality, I guess.
Yeah, and I think a good thing to consider here too is like this kind of goes into your next weakness, which is talking about the lack of character development, which we talked about a little bit here. But
Mm.
they do feel like kind of two-dimensional characters, right? Like they have like kind of a single track mind on one goal, which is banging, cheerleaders, and that's kind of their main focus until the very end of the film. And you're kind of left with like, okay, like these aren't like sometimes like you'll look at the dialogue and you'll see that cringiness, sort of like that teenage like sort of thing, and you'll be like, okay, yeah, that's kind of it. Um, but then you'll see that two-dimensional character, and you'll be like, that doesn't feel realistic. Although, I guess to counterpoint that, if I'm gonna play devil's advocate here, um, you could argue that like due to a teenager not really having a strong sense of self, it could be that they are so focused and so selfish on that one particular goal that they don't really like come to grips with all the other shit going on in their lives.
I think that's true. And I think kind of being one dimensional and kind of sociopathically self interested, I think that can work in other teen stories. But like, kind of a big element of this entire film was the idea of like how community and caring about things beyond your own yourself like empowers you, strengthens you, allows you to kind of come out into the world.
Mm,
And for a film that really emphasizes that point, the women in the Fight Club do not really develop or interact in any sort of meaningful way. You know what I mean? And
yeah.
it kind of does feel like, um, the kind of redemption arc at the end of the story for many of the women in the Fight Club is not deserved, and that they
Yeah.
don't like they were not in a fundamental sense like changed um by the Fight Club in the way that kind of I think the story wants you to feel like they do.
Yeah, and I will say, another thing I was thinking about, because I see the next point is like about the lack of critique on violence in community. You could also talk about like how at the very end, after committing all those violent acts, they're just kind of unfazed, and they make a joke about it. They're like, "We're gonna process this later," type thing. But also like, it's like one of those things where again, it's so absurd that it borders on the line of like, you know, come on, like you need to at least have like those moments of like groundedness compared to like the absurdity in the film, right? Because like,
I would agree.
yeah, because it does tend to, make it so that when you have those level moments where you have that drama and you have that like, um, these conflicts, it just tends to minimize them to like a joke.
And I think even if you view the violence as like obviously very allegorical and you don't um, really focus on that element as much, I do think the other element about the violence element and the masculinity element is like, for a story filled with queer people that's kind of talking about like finding yourself, it's a movie that's a very strong binary between like women and men.
Mm,
And like, the women are really the only people in the story who do kind of grow and change. And the way they change is largely by just adopting all of the elements of the football team, like the violence and kind of this sense of toxic masculinity. And like, the football team is kind of like critiqued for just being kind of a hive mind where like kind of the football star has this like cultish kind of power, but that's ultimately what the female Fight Club is. I mean, they are also violent. They're also toxically masculine. They find their own sense of autonomy by kind of being the worst of what the football team is. And then, you know, um, PJ and Josie just have enormous amounts of influence and power that they do abuse throughout the story. So
yeah.
it does feel like a very muddy sort of conclusion. And the film, I don't think ever. I think the film does a very good job critiquing a lot of things about like the patriarchy and gender roles, but it never really props up any sort of like useful way of actually rebelling or sort of being different.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those films that has a lot to say, but I don't think it puts the finishing touches on the sentence. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
it feels like kind of like if you read like a nice short story, but it feels like the complete ending is just undercut by not really being fully thought out. Not to say that it's a bad film. It's just I feel like they they kind of bit off a lot, and I don't know if they bit off a little more than they could chew. You know?
Yeah, I would agree. I think like the coming of age and kind of feminist elements of the film, um, they do kind of drown out like kind of the queer elements that I think they wanted to kind of make very prominent, but never were really as important.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think a lot of the kind of conclusion elements about community and about belonging, they were also kind of drowned out by just like the sheer amount of kind of insanity and violence that
Yeah.
was kind of occurring.
Yeah. So the last point you put here in our little sheet here is incoherence. So this is a good time to talk about it since you just mentioned it. So in terms of the incoherence, like what is something that really stuck with you as like something? I mean, we've talked about the absurdity of it, how there's a lot of plot holes and a lot of things that tend to like fall through. But what is something that really sticks out to you that makes this weakness like one you wanted to list here as well?
Well, I think there are a lot of like unintentional paradoxes of the film where like especially kind of the end where like the girls fight club gains kind of the respect and love of the entire high school by like just murdering all the Huntington players where
Mm,
like there's kind of a halfway point in the film where the football guys at like a prep rally, they essentially have one of the women in the fight club fight like one of the football players to kind of prove that like the fight club hasn't worked and just men are always stronger than women. And that could have been an interesting thing about how like empowerment doesn't have to just be like literal. But then kind of by the end, I mean, the women kind of gain their status back and connect to each other by just violently murdering dozens and dozens of men, basically with their bare hands.
which,
So I
yeah,
feel
it
like there's a
does.
lot of points like that in the film where you know, um, like it undercuts its message and there are kind
Yeah,
of paradoxes in what it's saying.
yeah, and I think like by having a film with this many themes and this many things to touch on, it's hard to really do that in a way that like hits on everything, right? It's one of
Mm-hmm.
those things where to use another metaphor, it's like having an you ever heard the phrase ocean wide but kiddie pool deep?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I think it succeeds on some notions, but I think it tends to fall flat on a lot of them, unfortunately. But are there any other weaknesses, strengths, themes you want to talk about before we start to wrap up here?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we should rate it.
Sure.
I think this is a really, really funny comedy.
Hmm.
I think it has like a really unique flair, and I think it's highly entertaining. And I think on that regard, like it's massively successful. But like I think it's not particularly polished, and I do think, um, in terms of wanting to be perceived as more serious, I think in that I think it really struggles. I think it has a lot of good points about like analyzing the problem, but the solution is just sort of like washed away by kind of just the spectacle of it. I think.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think for me, if I had to rate it on my scale, it'd probably be like an 8, 7.5, somewhere around there. It felt like one of those films where, I would enjoy doing it as like a casual watch, but to be one of those films that like kind of enter the echelon of like, okay, this is like a great film. that I would like love to revisit at some point. I don't think it's quite that, but it's definitely like I feel like one of those fun like popcorn watches, you know?
Yeah, I would agree. I think if it had a little bit more heart and it had balanced itself a little bit better, I think it would be up there with like Mean Girls. But again, I think this is we're talking about I think Arrival being a really difficult project because of just the story.
Mm-hmm.
I think trying to make kind of a heartfelt, touching, um, coming of age story while also having it be this kind of over the top, kind of violent sort of story that's like very kind of unrealistic, and then also having it kind of be like a feminist analysis film. I mean, that's a lot of different directions,
On top
and I
of
think
being
it would
like
be
about queerness as well. Like
yeah.
there's a lot of like things going on. So yeah, I would say definitely an ambitious film, definitely a film worth checking out. Any final thoughts before we check out here or
I don't think so. I think we covered everything.
okay. Well, that is our episode for Bottoms. Feel free to check out any of our other episodes, and thank you so much for listening. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.